Okay, this is the Nikkormat FTn. The Nikkormat was the brand that they called their cameras before they changed them all to Nikon. They are a all-mechanical camera, kind of like a Pentax K1000 in that there's no battery that runs the shutter. It doesn't have any bells or whistles on it. It just has an aperture ring that runs around the lens here, and a shutter setting that's actually a collar inside here. I don't know if you can see that. It's an actual collar, and the shutter speeds are right here, right at that black dot is where you set the shutter and let the camera know what shutter you want to work with. So back in the old days, Nikon didn't put the shutter ring up above. They actually used it on the collar like the Olympus does. There's also another trick to this. When you buy a Nikkormat, if it doesn't have a AI or an AIS lens, you have to mount the camera while the aperture, if I can do this, is on 5.6 to take it off. And what that does is 5.6 on the lens perfectly aligns with the little pin right there that's going to calibrate the lens to the meter. That's what that little doodad is, those little ears they call them, on the Nikon cameras. You need to have a index, it's called indexing, so that the camera can be able to read and set the exposure. Now, I'm trying to take it off and it won't take it off because I'm using one hand. I need to get it to 5.6, and then if I turn it off, it'll come off. So remember, 5.6 is your magic number for lining up with this pin right here. All right, that's what those two little ears are for. Now this lens actually has this little black ridge here. If you can see that tiny little ridge underneath these little numbers, that ridge means that on the newer cameras, they made it so that you don't need to use that. But Nikon was nice because they kind of left that on even their newer lenses in case you had an old camera and wanted to still use it. But once you see this little ring extension right here with that little protrusion, if you can see that, that's called either AI or AIS. That's the addition that they put on the lens that worked with a simpler lever on the newer Nikons so that you didn't need to use the ears. On this camera, the mirror box all looks very clean. I don't see any problems in there. Again, it's a little bit on the dirty side. I see dirt all along this little inside edge. I take a cotton swab and a little bit of rubbing alcohol. I'm not too afraid of like hurting anything. I don't use a lot of alcohol and it evaporates, and I'm using it, you know, it's not soaking, it's not dripping. Be careful, work smartly, and you can do that too, and don't pay to have that done. So again, use the lens on 5.6 to mount the lens on a camera body that doesn't have the ability to use that AI indexing. So even though this lens can work with this older camera, if you had a camera that didn't have, or I'm sorry, if you had a lens that didn't have that little extra extension on the lens, that would be a non-AI lens because it doesn't have that little protrusion. It requires you use these ears. If you try to use a non-AI lens on a AI body, there's nothing for it to index with because the newer cameras don't have pins and they have a little real tiny lever that protrusion catches on, and your lens wouldn't have that. So if this is considered a non-AI body, but you can use AI lenses on it. But if you have a non-AI lens, it doesn't have the little plastic protrusion. If you don't have a non-AI lens, you can only use it on non-AI bodies. On the other bodies, it won't index at all. So again, if you find a camera like this, this has a nice 50mm f2 lens. If you see it with green, blue, and pink and yellow numbers, like this lens has, that's a good example of, this is like what I would call their mid-range, mid-era lenses. When they first came out, they had all their big, boxy grips on the lenses, and they were non-AI lenses. Then when they came out with the AI lenses, they had the letters that were green, pink, yellow, and blue, typically at the end of the cycle, at the end of the stops. When you get into their AIS lenses, the 16 will be orange, and usually the later the lens, the better condition it's in, just because it's simply newer. But check for that. I have no problem with using older AI lenses versus AIS, but you can tell the AI lenses typically are using these color apertures, green, pink, yellow, blue, and then the AIS lenses always have the orange 16. It's got a little meter window in here, so you can actually see your meter reading while you're not quite looking through the lens. I don't find that all that necessary, but back in the day they were looking for ways to make photography more easy, and that was what they came up with. It's got an exposure counter on top. Again, we'll check to see if the shutters sound right. This is a thousandth of a second because you set the number to this black dot right here. And that sounded like a fast shutter. Here's a 30th. That sounded slower comparatively. Here's a half a second. That sounded slower yet. Here's an 1/8. You should be able to see the aperture stopping down and opening back up. Again, the blade should be snapping open and closed. Nothing slow and sticky. Again, you should look through the viewfinder, make sure the viewfinder looks perfectly clear. This one does. So, good basic camera, nothing too special. It's kind of a bare bones metal camera that you really can't hurt. It's been around for 40 or 50 years, and it'll probably last a few dozen more, as long as you take some care of it and don't hit it into too many doorways. All right, that's the Nikkormat FTn. I'll see you next time. We'll talk about some other cameras.